In this video, we're going to go over learning objectives number 3, 4, and 5. Learning objective 3 explain two main purposes of the criminal justice system. Number 4, outline the 3 levels of law enforcement. And 5, list the essential elements of the correction system. You probably have a familiarization with these learning objectives already. But let's go through them and see if we can pick them apart a little bit. Our book does a good job of helping us to understand the two main purposes of our criminal justice system. The first is managing or providing justice to all members of society. And so what is justice? What does justice mean? Justice means that all individuals are equal before the law, and that they are free from arbitrary arrest or seizure. So this idea of justice, it's linked with the idea of fairness. So the first one is maintaining or providing justice. The second is our second heading, protecting society. Our second purpose is to protect society, a far-reaching objective, and it involves the fair treatment of criminals and those who may or may not have actually committed acts. Our book describes 4 goals of our criminal justice society, the first one being to protect society from potential future crimes of the most dangerous or risky offenders, to determine when an offense has been committed and provide the proper punishment for that offense, to rehabilitate those offenders who have been punished so that it's safe to return them to society. We don't want to keep them in prison forever. And to support our victims to the extent possible and return them to their pre-crime status. So really, once again, what are the two main purposes? Maintaining justice and protecting society. So keep those broad terms in your mind throughout this entire course as we explore it deeper. And how do we do this? Well, we do it through what we call the 3 C's: cops, courts, and corrections. Remember, cops is all law enforcement, both local, federal, and state. And we're going to be talking about that in just a minute. Before we dive into that, though, we have to understand this concept of federalism. And although they didn't list it as an objective, it probably should be, because it's has some very foundational importance. The idea of federalism in this country, the definition here is a form of government in which powers are shared between the national, i.e. the federal government, and the states. So what does that really look like? Well, back in the day, the United States Constitution gave the national government certain express powers. They could make money, they could raise an army, they could regulate interstate commerce. All the other powers were left to the states, including police power. So back in the 1900s, only about 100 specific activities were illegal under the federal criminal law. Today, there's nearly 5,000 federal criminal statutes. So, up at the highest level, we have the federal system, then we have the state system, and we even go farther. We have a local system. So, if you live in the village or city of Bolingbrook or Plainfield or Romeoville, those are all what we call local levels. And so we actually have 3 levels of law enforcement as well. We have the federal law enforcement, we have the state law enforcement, and we have the local law enforcement. For example, I'm not positive, I'm 99% positive that marijuana is legal for recreational use in many states. This map is showing us back from 2017, but it's more states have legalized recreational use of marijuana since that time. But the reality of it is it's still a federal law. Federally, you cannot possess marijuana. So we can see that we have some kind of conflict sometime. So while in Illinois, you're an Illinois resident, you can smoke marijuana legally, recreationally, but from a federal standpoint, it's still against the federal law to possess marijuana. So that gets confusing. So this idea of the federal system, federalism, we have the federal system and we have the state systems, and sometimes they conflict. And sometimes we have to determine, well, which one has priority? Well, generally speaking, the federal systems always trump the state systems. Let's take a look at law enforcement specifically. So the ideas of federalism can be seen pretty clearly in the local, state, and federal law enforcement levels. On the local level, we have law enforcement duties. They're kind of split between the counties and municipalities. The counties, like in Illinois, we have 102 counties. So each county has its own law enforcement system. They all have their own individual sheriff's department, like the Will County Sheriff's Department, the Cook County Sheriff's Department, the DuPage County Sheriff's Department. And then we have, within the municipalities, we have all those local law enforcement levels. And that includes the major cities, such as Chicago. So we have, as mentioned before, Plainfield PD, Bolingbrook PD, Romeoville PD, Chicago PD. All of those are considered local law enforcement. At the state level, all the states have a state law enforcement agency except for one. That's Hawaii. Hawaii is the only state that does not have a state law enforcement agency. And generally speaking, those state agencies are divided into either state police or highway patrol. And like in Illinois, we have the Illinois State Police, and they're not called police officers, they're called troopers. They patrol mostly the public highways and the freeways. There's also state fire marshals, state fish and game wardens. Some states actually have state alcohol beverage control officers as well. At the federal level, so we have local, we have state, and now we have federal. The federal level, that's all the federal law enforcement agencies, and it's expanded quite a bit over the course of years. So for example, after 9/11, the Department of Homeland Security was created, and they restructured the federal law enforcement system. And today there's over 24 federal agencies under the Department of Homeland Security to protect the United States from terrorist attacks. And then we have additional federal agencies that provide additional services. So they fall under the Department of Justice, which, for example, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, the Secret Service, ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco, and even the Postal Service and the Forest Service has some kind of police powers. So that pretty much summarizes our law enforcement, the C of the three C's, the cops, right? In our court system, remember this concept of federalism, federal and state. In this country, we share that in our court system. We have in the United States a dual court system. We have a federal court system that prosecutes federal crimes. Remember those 5,000 federal laws? Yeah. And then we have the state court system. And the state court system prosecutes all the state laws. And that leads us into our third objective. List the essential elements of the correction system. So the essential elements of the correction system are probation, incarceration, and our community-based corrections. What is probation? Probation. So after an individual is arrested by the police, arrested by the cops, prosecuted by the courts, now we get into our third C, the correction system, the punishment aspect of it. After a person is arrested, found guilty and convicted of an offense, then they're sentenced and they move into our correctional system. Probation allows offenders to return back to the community while remaining under the supervision of the court, specifically a probation officer. So probation, the offender doesn't serve any jail time or prison time. They're simply put on probation. They're found guilty. The judge sentenced them. Boom. I sentence you to 2 years of probation. The offender walks out of the court and he goes back into the community, back to his life. But he has to report regularly to the probation officer, and he has to meet the terms of his probation. If he doesn't, then he can be reapprehended by the police, brought back into the correction system, where he will actually be incarcerated, placed into a prison or jail. So that is our second element, incarceration. There's a difference between jails and prisons. Jails are short-term. In Illinois, jails house individuals up to 364 days. If you're sentenced to longer than a year, you will go to a prison system. The prison system is usually much more secure, much more harsh. It's a community, if you will, in and of itself. So jails, short-term, prisons, long-term. Short-term being less than a year, long-term being longer than a year. Jails also hold those people who are in custody awaiting trial, who cannot bond out, post a bond if they were issued a bond by the judge after they were arrested. And we'll explore that deeper later on in our chapter. So the first element of corrections is probation. The second one is incarceration. There's another element that's evolved over the course of years, and that's what we call community-based corrections. And it's really increased in popularity as the jails and the prisons have had problems with overcrowding and funding. So community-based facilities include halfway houses, residential centers, and work release centers. And these operate on the assumption that not all convicts benefit from incarceration in the jail or prisons. So they're not released back into society, but they're put in these halfway houses or residential centers where they can be in society, they work, but they live within these halfway houses and residential centers and work release centers. So they're much more restricted. They don't have as much freedom. After work, they have to go back into the centers, and they're probably not free to go to the bars and everything else like that. It's also important to understand parole. What parole means is people who have not finished, after they've been sentenced to their term in prison, their term of sentence, they can be put on parole. So it's probation is before you go to prison and jail. Parole is when you're released after you've served some time. We're going to cover corrections more deeply in chapters 12, 13, and 14.